aligned on a few objectives. Number one was that we wanted to make sure that we were having some interesting, interactive, and impactful conversations. I would include in that we also had the chance to learn from each other, learn from practices from the organization, one of the organizations that I work at, the Institute for the Future, and there were others that work for other futures institutions. So we're really excited to share and learn from each other. The second was that we wanted to explore preferred futures across industries or sustainable development goals. And there was a real interest in exploring futures of SDGs, which is what we're going to be focusing on for this meetup. And ideally, we have the chance to also create our own practices around transformative innovation. And transformative innovation is changing the systems that we live within, not just the products and services. So in the example of our focus today on health, we will be looking at what is the impact of the pandemic on healthcare or other areas within Switzerland, not just the products and services to deliver, for example, vaccines, or to create new wearable devices and apps that would increase health. So that's why we're focusing on transformative innovation. So with those agenda points, we thought it was a good idea to remind us of where we are. And this is actually an image that I recently found, which I thought was quite nice because it is called the Reality Apex. And I think it does a good job of identifying what do we mean when we talk about futures in relation to where we currently are and obviously where we came from. So I'm going to do the animation one more time just to get the effect. So if we are in the middle, we can look backwards or we can look forwards. Looking backwards is commonly known as present forwards, or doing what is also called forecasting. So we are in the middle. We are able to look at our experiences. Those experiences are clearly informed or codified by memory. But what is important for speculative design and futures thinking is to be able to see what will be coming or to have more clarity on what may come. And that was why we talked about the different scenarios, possible, probable, and preferable. And this probability space is where futures thinking is very important, primarily because it enables us to do what is called future back. And the difference between present forward to future back, which is also called backcasting, is that we as speculative designers, we can imagine futures, and then based on those imagined futures, we can begin to gain insights on what those potential futures will mean, and then we can identify actions which will inform the priorities that we have today. That's different than forward, moving from the present forward, where we're doing an analysis of where we currently are and then projecting actions to move us into new directions. So think about backcasting and a future back as a primary driver of the way that futurists will think and operate. Now, to make that a little more concrete, let's look at the different future scenarios. And this is a well-known work from Jim Dator. In 1979, he established, I believe, the first foresight doctoral program at the University of Hawaii. And he created 4 what he calls narratives of alternative futures. Now, obviously, we don't know what the future will bring, but our attitude will have an influence on what we see. Now, the common attitude that is brought to alternative futures in Hollywood is the dystopian view. And the dystopian view, you can see, is very much aligned to Dator's decline and collapse alternative future. A utopian view would be number 4, that transformation, where there's a new technology, a new change in the game, a new business, something that is significantly different. Now, the first 2 alternative futures that Dator outlines are interesting because they're not really the substance of Hollywood films, but they actually have a significant impact on the way that we operate in life, in industries, in education. It really has an impact across all of the activities that we do. One of them, the first one, is called continuation. And that means just there's really no significant change. There's some growth, but it's primarily business as usual. The second one, limits and discipline. This is where we begin to see behaviors adapting to internal or environmental limits. Now, this might seem a little bit theoretical, so I'd like to share with you the scenarios that were developed at the Institute for the Future on the question, what happens after the pandemic? So if we look at the exciting one, which is all about transformation, we could envision that social solidarity would happen. Now, what do we mean by that? Because of the pandemic, there would be a number of grassroots actions that would come together to help redefine the way healthcare is delivered. Now, these scenarios come from the United States, so keep an eye on more US-centric because of the fragmentation of the healthcare systems in the United States. We can imagine a utopia or a transformative scenario where healthcare practitioners, hospitals, insurance companies would all come together and reinvent healthcare. That's one scenario. And we actually identified a signal called the Mutual Aid Network. And the Mutual Aid Network is bringing a number of individuals together and crowdfunding to provide services in the beginning of COVID-19. Now, on the far left, right next to that, you see the dystopian view, the ungoverning. And I think that's kind of what we saw last week at the United States Capitol. Now, this is no longer a scenario, this is a reality. But at the beginning of the pandemic, when the Institute for the Future did this foresight exercise, they did see that armed protesters were actually already moving into the Michigan State Capitol building, and that's exactly what we saw happen last week at the United States Capitol in Washington, D.C. So this is a good example of a collapse scenario. Now, on the far left, you'll see a growth scenario, and the growth scenario is also a bit more positive, that the stimulus packages that, for example, the incoming president on Wednesday, and I think we're all excited to see Joe Biden and Kamala Harris take over as president and vice president. They've just announced, I believe it's a $1.9 trillion investment in many different areas of the United States as a result of the health crisis and the economic and unemployment crisis that's happening. And this is a growth scenario where most of the capitalists, and we could take, for example, the tech companies, they are actually getting even stronger. And they are the ones that are also then hopefully providing some feedback back into the economy to scale the stimulus. Now, if we look in the far right, our constraint scenario, the constraint scenario is an interesting one because what we envision happening here is the emergence of germ pods. And a germ pod is a concept that tries to indicate the social impact of the pandemic from the point of view of everyone knowing who has been vaccinated and who is not, knowing who has had COVID-19 and who is not, using that information, okay, which is becoming more and more available, as you can see below this COVID pass, which can scan a user's status from up to 100 meters away. So you can already begin to envision a scenario where you're able to identify people coming close to you if they've had the virus and if they've had a vaccine or both. And you could imagine that having an impact on, well, who would receive healthcare? Where would they receive healthcare? Would they be invited to any hospital, or would these be special hospitals? Would they be able to go into stores? Would they only be able to purchase things online? You could also see the impact on education. My daughter, for example, here in Zurich, this week is homeschooled because one of the kids in her class came down with COVID-19. Would that mean that she can't go to school anymore? In our building, we actually have close friends that have not had COVID-19. So we're only playing within the compounds of our apartment building. So you can see that there's also a physical impact of this constraint scenario. So those are examples of how the four scenarios of alternative futures can play out. Now, I'd like to, in the spirit of encouraging everyone to use these lenses in our interactive activity, is to share with you a small detail, but as designers, I think you should all appreciate this. My colleague, Jane McGonigal, who I mentioned at our kickoff, has an online Coursera course for futures thinking, which I highly recommend. She actually did a 5-minute intro called 5 Minutes of the Future, and you can find that online or on this link here. And she talks about the importance of being able to have foresight with using specificity. And specificity, as a designer, I personally love the quote from the American architect Louis Kahn. He says, "God is in the details." Now, there is the German Bauhaus architect Mies van der Rohe. He's quoted as saying, "Devil's in the details." Whichever you choose or whichever you believe in, the fact is that there is a lot of richness in details. So we can imagine a low specificity of a statement like you upload your vaccine data into a personal health record. That is low specificity because it's only identifying vaccine data. It's not saying what that data is. A personal health record does not mention at all what other information is there, who has access to it. It doesn't mention where you've uploaded the data, why you uploading data, how did you feel. So what's important when creating these alternative futures, when creating these scenarios, is to do whatever you can to be more specific, because that is what is going to lead to a much more vivid version of the story. And to wrap up, this specificity training is very important as a futurist, as a speculative designer, and it will help you along each step of the four futures thinking cycle, which from the IFTF perspective begins with foresight. From foresight, creating those alternative futures, you gain insights. And from having a good understanding of those insights, what is different about that potential future, you can then identify actions. And the more specific they are, the higher level of motivation, the more of a sense of urgency to actually put into place actions that will either prepare you and your communities or colleagues for that preferred future or to prevent possible futures. So those are just a couple of framing elements that we thought would be important for this session. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Sybil and Kirsten.